Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and I want to welcome you to, from my perspective, which I try to do each week, to talk about the things that we are covering in our American history class to 1877. And just to give you my personal perspective, we get a lot of perspectives in this course from the textbook, from the video, and the other study materials that you get. And I think it's important for me to maybe add a word along the way, maybe from the years that I've spent in teaching the course and from my vast reading over the years. Uh, America Tonight, 1877 is a very interesting course. It is a very rich course, as you saw in week one, where there are many different things that we could talk about at length. I think one of the more interesting things from week one is the first perspectives of the Spanish, which were the first Europeans to arrive on the continent that we have documented. You understand, when we say that Columbus did not discover America, we now know that there were a lot of other people that discovered it before he did. The Native Americans, of course, were transplants from Eurasia to America at some point back in the Ice Age. We have now fairly well confirmed that with DNA and the Human Genome Project to prove that Native Americans are distant relatives of Euro-Asians. So they apparently came across either on the Bering Strait during the Ice Age or by boats or whatever else the way they got here. At any rate, that's a very important point that recent science has documented and helped to prove history in the past. We know on the West Coast that Russians had settlements there at some point, and we do know that the Vikings had settlements on the East Coast in the northern parts. And the Vikings were great world travelers. And so basically, when we say Columbus discovered America, that is an error. The other thing that I want you to think about, and I'm going to post a link to the Columbus journals and let you kind of look at those if you want to, it's not required, but to get Columbus's first impressions of Native Americans. And it wasn't a very good impression. The things that he put in his journal about the fact that they didn't wear clothes and they had no religion, and that the men were lazy and went out and hunted and fished all day and left the women to do the work. Those kind of perspectives, you got to remember, Columbus is looking at them through a European set of spectacles. Men went out at home, they went out and they hunted and fished as a recreation, not realizing that the Native Americans had to have that as a food source. And so basically he is doing what we often do, and that is reading the history through his eyes and through the lens of a European. They did wear clothes, they were not completely naked, and they did have religion. They just didn't have Christian Bibles and crosses. And so that is a very interesting evaluation on Columbus's part. But the thing is that those things that he wrote down went back to Europe, got into travel journals. And you've got to remember that we're very close to the inventing of movable type by Gutenberg and the advent of the printing press, which published and put all these things out there and people began to read. And so first impressions become lasting impressions. And the impressions that Columbus made, or the impressions made by the Native Americans on Columbus that he wrote down and were published, became the impressions of many people in the world. And those will follow the Native Americans throughout their lifestyle, their lifetime. I actually teach the Native American class at Columbia. I encourage you to take that sometime if you get a chance. It is very illuminating. We often don't get to spend a great deal of time talking about Native Americans in this class, but because it is a subject of interest, you'll hear me from time to time add things into the discussion that I think you ought to be aware of. So I'm going to send you a link to Columbus's journal. So sometime if you get a chance, if you want to do extra reading, have more interest in the subject, you can always do that. I also want to talk to you a little bit about the different settlements, and we're getting this week into very quickly into the main line of what this class is about, and that is the English settlements in the New World. But there were several countries. Spain is first. Their main motivation was gold and silver. As I have said to you at length last week, the gold and silver that came out of the New World, there were massive amounts of it. In fact, there was so much of it in Central and South America that the Spanish set up their own coining operation off the coast of what is now, or on the coast of what is now Florida. And so we still are finding Spanish galleons that sank in storms filled with coined gold that was being sent back to the mother country. Because of that, Spain becomes the richest country in Europe. In that day, there was no animal like borrowing money for waging war, paying for war. The money your country had was in gold and silver in the palace, in the vault, and that's what you had to use if you're going to wage war against other countries. Spain was a very famously dedicated country to Rome, to the Catholic Church. And so they took this money, and for the most part, they used it to try to enforce their pressures upon those countries at this time also, which were leaving the Catholic Church in the Protestant Reformation, like England, France left and then came back, of course, Germany, the Holland and the Netherlands. All of these countries were involved in the Protestant Reformation. And so if you remember, particularly the Spanish Armada was a exercise by the Spanish to try to force the English back into the Catholic Church. And of course, it failed miserably. And that was the kind of the last hurrah for Spain. They lost their entire fleet in the English Channel for the most part. And so they gave up on that enterprise. And Spain then declined because gold declined. They had virtually farmed all the gold out of the New World. I mentioned something last week in the notes very interesting about a book that has been written called The Rivers of Gold, which introduced to us how African slavery first is introduced into the New World. And that was done to the Spanish because they literally exterminated most of the native population, working them to death in gold and silver mines. And then also the sugar plantations in the Bahamas will do the same as well. And so they literally sent word back to Spain and said, we don't have any more natives to work in the mines. Where are we going to get labor? And the suggestion from the king or queen was to go to Africa and begin to import African slaves. And that's a story that is going to greatly affect our story as we move forward. So Spain's motivation was gold and silver. The French came looking for a water route around the North American continent. And you got to remember that they had no idea at the beginning there was this continent here. They had no concept of how large it was. They thought maybe they could sail around it because they're still trying to get to the west or to the east by sailing west and get to China and to get to spices and the things that they're wanting from the Orient. And so the French dedicate themselves to trying to find this water route. They sail down the St. Lawrence River as far as the Great Lakes, and they discover that this continent is much, much larger than they envisioned it to be. And they get, though, along the way involved in the fur trade. And this is one of the interesting things about France and how it became this socially dominant force in the world of clothing and fabrics and hats and all these things, is because they get involved with trading for furs, and they cause this fur revolution, or this dress revolution in France. It's going to spill over. Everybody wants a beaver hat or a fur coat and all these things. And so that's their introduction to the economic side of the New World. Interestingly enough, the French, who were also Catholic, were the only ones of the major group that took the time to learn anything about the Native Americans' practice of reciprocity, and that is of gift giving. They had this process they went through when they met people in which they exchanged gifts and they became friends, and they built upon that. And the French Catholics went through the process of the time of learning. And as a result, they were the most successful in planting their religion among Native Americans. And so you will see many Catholics among Native American peoples because of that. And because the Catholic Church had ties, and I won't go into that right now, but there's a reason why their religion was much more acceptable to the natives, because they were teaching people that couldn't read, illiterate people. And the Catholic Church had learned that in the 6th and 7th century when Rome fell and literacy had disappeared. Many of the things in the Catholic Church have to do with teaching people the basic things of the Bible through pictures and processes and garments and all those things. And so the Native Americans were attracted to that. And so the French basically centered in what was now the St. Lawrence River Valley, then down the Mississippi as far down as New Orleans. And of course, we will get to that again when we talk about Thomas Jefferson purchasing the Louisiana Purchase. This week, we're going to talk about the English, and the English are latecomers to the New World. They're busy with other things. For one thing, in the 1500s, they leave the Catholic Church with Henry VIII's problem with his wives, and they set up a new church, the Anglican Church, with the king as the potentate, as the pope, if you will, of the Anglican Church. And so they're busy with these things and internal strife and wars and a lot of other politics, but they finally get here, and we get to that this week and talk about that. The interesting thing about the English is they come as families because they are mainly escaping religious persecution. There are a lot of dissidents coming, as we know, from the Puritans who came here, or the Pilgrims. There were Puritans and Pilgrims, and those are two different groups. The Puritans are a subset, the Pilgrims are a subset of the Puritans who had withdrawn from the Anglican Church in 1604, had spent 11 years in Leiden in Holland, because Holland was very much receptive to religious dissidents. And once the children of Holland began to rub off on the Pilgrims' children, they wanted to come to America to get away from that. So that kind of lays the foundation for that. So the first English settlements, there are some that come for business purposes. They're not religious. Many of those fail, and you'll see that as you read your materials this week. Several failures. Roanoke Island, an entire group of people disappear, and they're still doing excavations. That is right above where I live, and they still have found not hide nor hair of them, and don't know what happened to them, whether they were absorbed into Native American populations or whether they just simply starved to death and were eaten by wild animals or whatever. They didn't find a bone. They haven't found a feather, basically. So the English start clinging to the coast of North America, Plymouth and Salem, Massachusetts, Virginia. Those areas are going to be the beginnings of America's, or the English colonies in America that are going to grow into, by 1774, 75, fairly major economic enterprises that are tied to Great Britain, and we will pick that up as we go along. So I want to just kind of lay that foundation today of what you are going to be looking at, and realize when we talk about the Pilgrims that there's a very interesting study there. In fact, I've spent most of my life studying American religious history, and it's tied in with the Pilgrims and their links in the future to what we have today as far as fundamentalist evangelicals. The Pilgrims were very much their forebears. And so we'll get to talk about some great things this week. So as you engage the discussion board, I hope to respond to you in kind and share some other things with you. But I want to take this time to just kind of lay the foundation of what we're talking about. And I look forward to seeing some of you later in live chat this week. Hope you will be able to do that. And until then, or until next week, we will talk then. Thank you.